both the Washington Post and the New York Times last night had pretty detailed reports about the refugee issue. They suggested that the president himself overruled national security experts on his team and Secretary of State Blinken. You've sort of maintained that there was never a policy change at all, but is it fair to say at this point that the president changed his mind from the 62,500 number and then changed his mind again once he saw the sort of outrage and blowback from Democrats and refugee groups?
Well, I can say that we have every intention of putting out an increased cap, and we hope to do that soon, in advance of May 15th. I'm obviously not going to get into private conversations between the president and members of his national security team, but I will say that one of the things that has been on the president's mind that I think was covered in a number of those stories are the challenges and the challenges to our resources. And we've talked about this a little bit. So one of those is refugee processing in a big global system. And there were muscles that have been atrophied over the last few years. It's not just the federal government. It is also a lot of important organizations around the world that help address this. And his concern was in part, is that system prepared? Now, by setting a larger cap, which we have every intention of doing, we are sending a message, get your muscles back in action so that we can welcome more refugees and continue to strive toward the goal that he has always maintained of 125,000 refugees for next year. Our policy has not changed on that front. We've always wanted to reach 125. It's just a matter of what we think we can get to this year.
Well, the State Department is in charge of processing refugees.
Mm-hmm.
If the Secretary of State is encouraging the president to sign the paperwork to raise the cap, that would suggest that he feels that the State Department, despite whatever atrophy may have happened, could have raised that limit, and that the president, because of perhaps, worries about if HHS could support the refugees when they got here, perhaps because of political calculations, overruled the Secretary of State. And so I'm asking if you can explain why, if the State Department says that they can do this, the president didn't think that they could.
Well, first of all, it's setting a cap, right? It doesn't answer the question of whether we can reach that. This is an important point of whether we can reach that point.
To get into this, right? Because there's no reason that the president couldn't have done what he said he was going to do, raise the cap to 62,500, and then if the State Department or HHS determined that they couldn't, process the refugees, just not hit that number. As you said yesterday or 2 days ago, that happens all the time. So
sure.
This just sort of
and he
underscores
has every intention of raising the cap. The Friday announcement was not about the top level of the cap. And I think that's an important thing for people to understand. But I'd also say, as you alluded to in your question, the State Department, yes, they do the they do the vetting, which is an important part of the process and can take months. And there are a low number of refugees that are currently through a security vetting process, despite numbers that have been put out there and in reporting which are inaccurate. There's a low number.
Hundreds of people that have already been.
What'd you say?
It's not hundreds of people that have already been approved by the State Department. I think the reports are something like 700 people have had to cancel flights because of.
And the flights have resumed. The flights have resumed as of Friday. But there's also another component of this because it's an interagency process that addresses refugees resettlement, right? ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is not a part of the State Department, has a component of this as well. It's a part of HHS. The president looks at all of the government, all of our resources available, what he thinks the capacity is, but he also is looking for assessments from the interagency team on what's possible. That's what his questions were. Hence, we'll have more to say when we have a conclusion on that.
I think we're talking past each other, so I'll just ask once more and then we
Okay.
can move on if you don't want to. But the question is whether the president changed his policy on the 6,500 and if on Friday you intended it to be 15,000 and then changed the decision after the outcry.
Well, his policy was on Friday, was months before, continues to be to reach 125,000 refugees in next fiscal year. 62.5 was a down payment. It will be slower this year than it will be next year. The president wants an assessment of how far we can get. That's what he's looking for. The State Department has a component of that. HHS has a component of that. We're going to look at all of that. And the refugee cap, and the point I've been trying to make, which I know you don't love, but that's okay, but to others, is that the cap is something that is not typically reached. We wanted to send a clear message. We are a country that is welcoming refugees. We recognize that that is not the message that was sent, and so we reassessed. But it's not a change in policy. It's just making sure we're sending a clear message to the world about who we are. America's back. We're welcoming refugees. We need to get our muscles back working again, and we'll have an updated cap hopefully soon. Go ahead, Trevor.
To the point about